A couple of weeks ago, news hit that shocked everyone. A number of months after filming had begun on the Han Solo movie at Lucasfilm, it was announced Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were no longer directing, with the subsequent announcement that Ron Howard would be taking their place. What happened? How is this normal? This seems like a disaster in the making, but is it? While it is out of the ordinary for a director to be booted off a film many months into principal photography, there are quite a few famous instances of this sort of thing happening. And I'm going to highlight these films before digging into what might happen with the Han Solo movie. I've commonly brought up The Wizard of Oz as a film that went through a disastrous production, which doesn't stop it from becoming a beloved classic. But it really is a case of everything that can go wrong during the making of a film. Richard Thorpe was the original director, but it was felt his footage was unusable and he wasn't getting the right performances from the actors, so he was fired and eventually replaced with Victor Fleming, although much of the creative direction of The Wizard of Oz came from George Cukor's brief stint as director between Thorpe and Fleming. However, Fleming had to leave the production early and the Kansas scenes ended up being directed by King Vidor. Yet watching The Wizard of Oz, one would think it was a smooth production. Now, why did Fleming leave The Wizard of Oz? Not because of arguments with the studio or because he was fired, rather it was to direct Gone with the Wind, and once again he took over for George Cukor. Cukor had already been directing Gone with the Wind for 3 weeks before he was replaced by Fleming due to producer David O. Selznick disagreeing with how he was choosing to direct the movie. However, some of Cukor's footage does still remain in the finished film. It's fascinating that Victor Fleming's 2 most famous works were films he initially didn't have anything to do with. But he was exactly the kind of director MGM trusted to jump into a production without hesitation and knew how to command the proper respect on set. Jumping ahead a number of years, one of the more infamous cases of a director being replaced is the film Spartacus. This film was Kirk Douglas's baby, and unimpressed with Anthony Mann's direction the first week, he fired him. Stanley Kubrick, who had directed Douglas in Paths of Glory, took over those duties. Kubrick never really considered Spartacus his movie, as it's the one film he didn't have creative control on, and he mostly just saw himself as a higher-on director. Another epic at the time that famously switched directors was Cleopatra. The original director was Ruben Mamoulian, who had to deal with Fox breathing down his neck about the daily cost, Elizabeth Taylor being frequently unavailable due to illness, constant rewrites, and bad weather. After 3 months, he was replaced with Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who had the tricky task of rewriting the entire script, starting almost everything from scratch, and with Cleopatra eventually becoming the most expensive film made at the time. A case that became so controversial the Directors Guild of America instituted a new rule was the Outlaw Josey Wales. Philip Kaufman was the original director, but he and Clint Eastwood did not get along, mostly in regards to Kaufman's directing style. Eastwood got Kaufman fired and took over the film himself. This led to the Eastwood Rule, which bars an actor, producer, or others involved in the movie from taking over if the director steps down or is fired. These are just a couple of examples of this happening on live-action productions, but it's far more common to replace a director on an animated film during development or even production. Pixar does it frequently, most famously on Toy Story 2, Ratatouille, Brave, and The Good Dinosaur. Considering Disney film executives do converse with each other, I would not be surprised if the idea to remove Lord and Miller was potentially suggested by John Lasseter. He and Ed Catmull are pretty open about how if he and the rest of the brain trust at Pixar or a story group at Disney Animation feel a film is not working under the current director, they will replace them. Although probably the most famous case of an animated film replacing the director even after animation and storyboards have been up is Disney's The Emperor's New Groove. Roger Allers originally envisioned the film as Kingdom of the Sun, a dramatic musical epic in the vein of Pocahontas and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Disney was confident enough in the film and Allers started animation production and recording the voices. However, they felt at some point it wasn't working. It felt too busy with too much plot. This is all shown in the documentary The Sweatbox, which if you can find it is worth watching. Eventually, Mark Nindal was brought in to direct, Allers left the project, and they threw all the animation away, and some animators even left in protest of the changes. It's amazing watching The Emperor's New Groove and being aware of its production, as not a hint of its chaotic changes appear on screen. It really is the best example of making lemonade out of lemons. And that brings us to Han Solo. When it was revealed Lord and Miller had been taken off the project, people immediately thought of two other films, though I don't think the situations are exactly the same. First, of course, was Rogue One. Disney and Lucasfilm decided to ask Tony Gilroy to help out on these scheduled reshoots, although it's not the same, as Gareth Edwards was still involved with the production and had plenty of say in the final edit. The point behind cutting some scenes out, changing some things in the ending, and adding new scenes was mostly so they could include more cool scenes, like that one with Darth Vader. If you've seen the film, you know which scene I'm talking about. The other example was Ant-Man. Yes, Edgar Wright did leave the film after 8 years developing the project for Marvel and working on the script. However, that was before a single frame was shot. Marvel and Wright realized early on the relationship might not work out. Although when it was announced Peyton Reed would direct, the reaction amounted to, "Really? You're replacing the director of Hot Fuzz and Scott Pilgrim with the director of The Breakup and Yes Man?" Which to that I say, watch Down with Love, because that film is great and more people should see it. In the end, while we didn't get to see Wright's vision, Reed still did a good job with Ant-Man, and people are more on board with him also directing the upcoming Ant-Man and the Wasp. A similar reaction seems to be greeting Ron Howard. Really? You're replacing the directors of the Lego Movie with the director of the Da Vinci Code? Which to that I say, watch Rush, because this film is great and more people should see it. With Han Solo, there have been all these reports from quote-unquote unnamed sources about what's been going on during the production of the film. The prevailing idea is that, like with their animated projects and the Jump Street films, Lord and Miller have been taking an improv-like approach, and Lawrence Kasdan has not been taking kindly to this. People asking, well, haven't there been meetings before filming began? But as we saw with the previous examples, sometimes executives need to see dailies to get a better idea of a director's approach to a script. However, let's be honest, we don't know the full story of what's going on with the production and why exactly Lord and Miller have been fired. All I'm going to say is I don't think there are any heroes and villains in this situation. Lord and Miller are not these directors who are in over their heads and aren't team players. Reading up on how they worked with MTV on dealing with rewriting Gandhi for Clone High's non-existent second season when that character proved controversial shows they're willing to work with executives. They have also frequently praised former Sony head Amy Pascal for helping add an emotional element to Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs that was missing in their initial drafts. And Kathleen Kennedy is not this dictatorial producer and studio head imposing her view on the Star Wars films. Honestly, with a long list of successful credits at Amblin, Lucasfilm, and her own company she ran for many years, she clearly knows what she's doing. And as somebody who loved The Force Awakens and Rogue One, at the moment I don't have any reason to doubt her skills in handling a galaxy far, far away. These are individuals who just did not see eye to eye on where the project was headed and decided to part ways. People using this announcement say Kennedy should be fired and Colin Trevorrow should also be fired from directing Star Wars Episode 9. And to be honest, rooting for a filmmaker to be fired, it just makes me queasy and uncomfortable. What has Trevorrow done? He made a couple of films you might have been disappointed in, but saying he should be kicked to the curb and not be allowed to direct again is pretty unnecessary. As for how Ron Howard will do in the chair, I think he'll be fine. He's the sort of director who can jump between varying genres, and he's proven he can direct effects-heavy scenes and work well with actors. Has everything he's directed been a gem? No, but he's definitely hit it out of the park on multiple occasions, as recently as Rush. That film is my favorite of his, and if he can bring that same level of excitement and character dynamic to the Han Solo movie, it should be something special. The biggest question people have seems to be related to tone and how Howard's style will mesh with Lord and Miller's. Lucasfilm still plans to use a lot of their footage, but it's not like the film will go from looking like 21 Jump Street to looking like Frost Nixon. Bradford Young will remain as director of photography, and so the scenes should remain visually consistent. Meanwhile, the editors will also work hard to make sure we don't figure out which scenes were directed by Lord and Miller and which were directed by Howard. In terms of credit, that's up to the Directors Guild to decide. This is quite an unusual case, and one the DGA will try to figure out. Maybe all three directors will receive credit, maybe only Howard. When the Lord and Miller announcement happened, I immediately thought of Superman 2. Richard Donner directed a good chunk of the film, and then after disagreements with the producers, left the production. In his place, they got Richard Lester, who reshot some of Donner's scenes and added plenty of his own. In the end, the DGA gave credit to Lester, even though a good amount of Donner's footage still appeared in the final cut. And yet, despite that happening in the middle of production, Superman 2 still turned out to be a pretty good film. So I'm not sounding the alarm bells for this Han Solo project. In the end, we cannot really judge if this will affect the finished film until we see it on the screen. As we saw from these previous examples, a director being replaced does not always lead to a catastrophe. We'll just have to wait and see if Ron Howard really is this generation's Victor Fleming. See you next time.